So before we started recording, I was telling Matt and Rachel that as kids, at least Indian kids who grow up in the United States, if your parents are Hindu, they really want you to learn the stories, but they tell you whitewashed versions of the stories. And today, we're learning about the Mahabharata, but the whitewashed version of the story they tell you, if anybody's watching and is the Ramayana. So Ramayana is a story of this prince, Rama, and like generally it's the story of him getting his kingdom back, right after he's like exiled. And during exile, he marries Sita, and Sita gets kidnapped by this demon, Ravana, and she finally gets saved by, Hanuman. And so when they come back, they come back to the kingdom and they live happily ever after. That's a story they tell you as a kid, but that's not really what happens. What happens is Rama and Sita come back to the king, Rama becomes king, but then the whole kingdom starts talking and they're like, hey, Sita was kidnapped by Ravana. Was she having an affair with Ravana? Was she really faithful to Rama? And like Rama goes to his wife and is like, hey, Sita, people are talking. You got to prove your faithfulness. And Sita is like, F you. And she like proves her faithfulness. She's like in the fire, right? Like she proves that she's been faithful. But then like the earth swallows her up and she dies. And Rama is like, oh man, what did I do? That's the real ending of the story. And so when you learn that as an adult, you're like, that's fucked up. So, yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so generally the Mahabharata is even longer and it's filled with more of those stories. Or you're just like, that's effed up. So, yeah.
Yes. All right. So should we get going? I think we're...
Yeah. We should introduce the guests. Yeah.
That would be a great idea. That's what we usually do.
So today we have Sohini. She is a PhD candidate at the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC-Berkeley, but she's starting her professorship in South Asian religions at Kalamazoo, right? Yep, in the fall. And we also have Nell Shapior Hawley. She is a professor of Sanskrit at Harvard. She is, or not professor, preceptor at Sanskrit at Harvard. She's also a PhD candidate in South Asian languages. Both of them have edited a book called The Many Mahābhāratas. It came out in 2021, and it's a great book. And they basically study South Asian religion, and it's a really great book. It's awesome. And so we're really excited to have them, mainly because I think you guys are our first South Asianists on the show. So I'm pumped. So yeah.
And also, go Bears.
Go Bears.
Sorry,
yeah.
Nell, and Rachel, I guess too.
I'm so sorry. Go Bears. Yeah.
That's right. Excellent. But the first question we ask all of our guests, which is of course the most important question that we will ask you all out for the entire hour, is Nell and Sohini, what are you drinking?
We have a couple different answers for you.
Okay.
Things. Which is a testament to Sohini's and my complimentary styles. So I'm drinking a Kir Royale, which I thought would be appropriate to the theme of royalty, leadership, and power in the Mahabharata. And
so I am not having one, but I'm having 3 margaritas, and let me show you. My wonderful friend Morgan came over and made them for me today. And there's a story behind this. So Many Mahābhāratas actually first started out as a symposium or
like a day-long conference
that we organized at the annual conference on South Asia in Madison, Wisconsin.
Way back in the day, 2016?
2017. Yeah. And after the conference, we had made arrangements for a group dinner for everyone who participated. And it was at this wonderful cafe called the Sunroom Cafe.
So great.
And they have $4 margaritas.
Yeah.
And we were
like anyone listening who's in Madison, Wisconsin, this place is wonderful.
Yes.
$4 margs.
And we were so excited. And we sent an email to a shared advisor we had who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. Her name was Anne Monius. She's a professor at Harvard and she was incredible. But we sent her the email just saying like, this is gonna happen. And by the way, PSA $4 margaritas. And she was like, Many margaritas! She was like, Mahābhāratas. And so I am having one. So there are 3, again, our amazing friend Morgan, she made jalapeno, lime, and watermelon. So I think I shouldn't drink all 3 during the show.
But we'll see how this goes.
That's right.
But no,
yeah. Oh my God, so time.
This is not drink with historians. This is drinking with historians.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I was impressed by a long time ago we had Ben Railton on, and he was double fisted with some beers. But 3 is, I mean, we're in uncharted territory right now. So
with the Mahābhārata, it's just like maximalism, right? Like so.
Yes.
Yes.
More is better.
That's right.
What are you drinking?
Rachel, how about you? What are you drinking today?
I decided to make myself a Pimm's cup tonight.
Ooh. I love Pimm's cup. I mean, we lived in London, and actually one of the first things that happened when I was a graduate student and my wife was working was we got invited to like this garden party, and it was a very English garden party, and they had Pimm's cup, and I had no idea kind of what a Pimm's cup was, which was, it was very lovely, but they just kept putting things into the cup, and I was like, is there a bet? Like, am I just gonna have to eat this out of the, like, I don't understand what's happening.
There's like a lot of
lots
things.
of things.
Yeah, lots of things.
Nice.
So, Varsha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I am having, because today is India Day, I'm having Amrit. Amrit, the word Amrita is literally immortality. That's what it means in Sanskrit. And it's like in the Mahabharata and in also these ancient Hindu texts, it's referred to as like the drink of the devas or the gods, which is supposed to grant you immortality. But obviously this is not going to grant me immortality. It's just really goddamn delicious. Like, I did not know that Indians could make whiskey. Like, every country makes whiskey. They make single malt, but India really knows how to distill whiskey. It's real good. So I'm excited. Yeah. How about you, Matt?
Perfect.
So I have some Woodford bourbon, double oaked, which is lovely. It's unfortunate. Well, it's in a mason jar because I broke the bottle, which is the long and short story version of the story is that I'm an idiot and I'm just a gangly klutz sometimes. But I quickly poured it into the mason jar and saved it. But it is delicious. I have a nice big ice cube in my bourbon because it's hot here, and that's for you, Varsha. So that's what I'm drinking today.
People who put ice in their whiskey, I can't.
This is
so
going to
wrong.
be the Yoko Ono that breaks us up. Is
Basically.
the ice cube, right? Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we should get started.
We should.
I think,
so
yeah.
well, let's say thank you to Rachel first.
Rachel, yeah.
And yes, thank you, Rachel. And remember, please, as Rachel put in the chat, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in the second half hour.
Yep.
Excellent.
So
All right.
before I ask you all about how you got to this book and how you started studying the Mahabharata, I do want to give people who don't know anything about Mahabharata a quick overview, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So the reason I want to give a quick overview is I read the whole thing. It's not like the actual unabridged version, because the unabridged version is like 20 books long. I did not read that. This is like an abridged version, and that itself is like 1,000 pages or something. But basically, it's an ancient Indian epic. Think Odyssey, think Aeneid, think Iliad, and it revolves around two branches, two groups of cousins: the Pandavas, 5 brothers, and the Kauravas, 100 brothers. And they fight the Kurukshetra War, which is a battle for the throne of Hastinapura, where all of this is located. Hastinapura is like in Madhya Pradesh, like modern day India, or somewhere in modern day India. It's there. It actually exists. And so the main characters are the Pandavas and the Kauravas. They're fighting this epic battle. Literally 18 million people die, I think. Like, it's a massive battle.
1.6 billion people die.
Yeah. A lot of people die.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And another important part of the story is, like, when you're a kid, you're told how it gets written down. And so I was told that Vyasa, who is a character in the epic, he's like this guy who's giving advice to everybody, who's just bearing children for people who can't have children. He actually writes the thing, but he tells, he's dictating the verses, and Ganesha himself, who's a god, breaks one of his tusks and writes it down. And that's what you're told. And then within this text is, during the battle, there's a really important religious text within this called the Bhagavad-Gita. And it's a bunch of verses within this text, and it's between Krishna and Arjuna. They're on the battlefield. Arjuna's freaking out because he has to fight his cousins. And he's telling Krishna, he's like, Krishna, we should just end this war. And Krishna's like, no, man, you got to do what you got to do. You were born a Kshatriya, which means a warrior. So you must fight your cousins. It's your duty. It's a really important text because it tells you about duty and, and the reason I find it interesting is, like, Brahmins really love it today, like the upper caste, like the really religious people, but it was written as a Kshatriya text, like the warrior text. it's written about that. So that's the Mahabharata. What did I get wrong?
That's great. I mean, one of our like maxims in the book and in our
Life.
shared scholarly life is that there is no way really to get the Mahabharata wrong.
There are many.
There are many Mahabharatas. There's so many different ways of telling it, of understanding it, of interpreting it, and the variations are incredible, right? So there's sort of no. There are I think certain really important like thematic and aesthetic and certain plot points that are like basic through lines that sort of connect any Mahabharata to any other Mahabharata. Right. But beyond that, you can really do anything.
Yeah, so just to give you an example, Varsha, so you said it's all about a war, right? Which is true for the majority, I would think, of Mahabharata retellings.
Vast majority of Mahabharata retellings.
But if you look at Jain retellings of the Mahabharata, right, from the Jain religious tradition, where they really value nonviolence and asceticism, yes, these two sets of cousins go to war, but nobody dies.
And then they all become Jain monks.
Become ascetics, and they're like, okay, so we fought this war, no one died.
Yeah.
See you later. And now works on a Mahabharata retelling where they completely avoid the war.
Yeah, the Mahabharata that I'm writing my dissertation about is and probably early-ish first millennium Mahabharata drama in 3 acts, at the end of which this happens like it's set before the war, before they go to war, and at the end of the play, the Pandavas and the Kauravas like basically make peace and like agree to split the kingdom, and Duryodhana, the eldest brother of the Kauravas, gives half the kingdom back to the Pandavas, and they supposedly live happily ever after. Really, so you can really do almost anything with the Mahabharata sort of framework.
Yeah.
So can I ask just a deeply naive question, as someone who's way outside of this, is that when you're talking about kind of the various versions of the Mahabharata, are we talking about kind of oral traditions? Are we talking about textual traditions? Some sort of combination of both? Like, kind of what do we mean when we say that?
All of the above.
Everything.
All of the above. Okay. Oral, performative, textual. There are Mahabharatas in tellings of the Mahabharata story, but we call them just by shorthand Mahabharatas. In every South Asian language, in every literary genre.
Southeast Asian languages.
It goes as far as East Java.
There's Arabic Mahabharatas from 11th, 10th century.
We have Persian Razamnama, like. It's amazing, and obviously tons in English.
Yes.
In modern times.
And so I probably similarly to Varsha, one of my first exposures to Mahabharata was through these comic books, these Amar Chitra comic books,
which are English Mahabharatas, right? Which is like another
in English.
Right?
Yeah. And I also learned the Mahabharata from when my Pati, my paternal grandmother from South India, would come and visit, and she would tell all these stories that would contradict things in the comic books, like you were saying, Varsha. Right. I would be like, wait, what is this? So you learn all these different like versions of stories, and I'm just always, my mind is blown by how different retellings can just like morph the story. So I'll just like give you another example that I just came across. So this might be a story you're familiar with, Varsha. Pardon my dog. I'm very sorry. She gets very excited when she hears about the Mahabharata. And dogs are also a very important character.
Dogs are
dogs are so important.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the dog since you're
No, you go.
You want to tell the dog story? And I'll be brief so she can make
Well, it's amazing that the Mahabharata ends with a dog. That just as Yudhishthira and his 4 younger brothers, oh my gosh,
they're ascending to heaven, right?
They're ascending to heaven, but it's not just them. I mean, they have their wife Draupadi with them, but they also have this dog, and it's the first that we've ever seen of this dog in the Mahabharata. He just sort of shows up in book 17 of 18. And everyone else dies off on the sort of ascent northward, and soon all that's left is Yudhishthira and the dog. And Indra appears, which is how you know things are gonna get a little funky.
The king of heaven.
Well, but he's also famously, you know, he loves to like disguise himself and trick people into things. And, you know, so you sort of immediately know like something's up, you know, when Indra shows up, right? And yeah.
It's like Loki showing up in like Marvel.
Yes. Perfect analogy. Perfect analogy. Amazing. I mean, and Arjuna, Indra has thunder too. So, oh my, Varsha, perfect analogy.
Yeah, I mean, we also have like side note, but we have a lot of like thoughts about analogies between the Mahabharata,
Game of Thrones, Star
mostly
Wars,
Game of Thrones, but a lot of other like these sort of incredible, like, you know, dystopian, post-apocalyptic, but like ultimately sort of medieval or early texts. Anyway,
so Indra
shows up and he's like, Yudhishthira, you are going to go to heaven in your own body. This is a big deal, going to heaven in your own physical body. And look at all the amazing things that you're going to find there. Like, this is going to happen. That's going to happen. You're going to be so happy. So many wonderful things to eat, people to hang out with, blah, blah, blah. But you can't bring the dog. and Yudhishthira really, he's like, no. Yeah. He's like,
I have to bring the dog.
Yeah. Yeah. And he ultimately then learns from Indra that, I mean, the end of the Mahabharata is, I don't even want to like laugh about it. It's amazing. Luckily, Wendy Doniger is about to, who's my PhD advisor, is about to come out with an English translation of the last three books. Last three and a little bit of book 15 books of the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata in English. And her translation is incredible. So everyone can like look out for that in the coming years. But the end of the Mahabharata is truly haunting. That at the end of it all, that Yudhishthira decides to, he says, I want to see my family. I want to see the people that I love. And he's already sort of made it past Indra's first test, and he's made it into this heavenly space where all this wonderful stuff is happening, but he doesn't see any of his family members. And he wants to be where they are. He wants to like see them and experience them. And so Indra tells a servant of his to take Yudhishthira to where his family members are. And it turns out that they are all in this like horrible hell space. And Yudhishthira doesn't even see them there. He walks down this horrible path, and it's dark and terrifying. And it smells awful. Like it's a multi-sensory experience. It's yet another reason that the end of the Mahabharata is so incredibly beautiful and just haunting. And he just hears them like calling out for him, Yudhishthira, stay here a while longer. You're making it smell better down here. Anyway, it's absolutely haunting. And he ultimately decides to stay down there. At which point that is, turns out that's the second.
Surprise! It's a plot twist. It's like, obviously Indra was lying.
Yeah, like surprise. And it turns out that, you know, then he has this vision of heaven where all of his family members are there, and all of their cousins are there, who they had all this enmity with. Everyone's there. They all sort of take on their like mythological personae. But the end of the Mahabharata really messes with you because it's intentionally, I think, saying, you know, what is real and what is not. Yeah. It's this beautiful, for all of everything that's happened earlier. This is just in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, this total sort of subversion of norms and precepts, and any rule that you thought was like governing the way things were is totally messed with earlier in the text. And then you get to the end and you sort of see that, like, in fact, one character's perspective was ultimately all that mattered. And it will just give you so much to think
go
about.
Back to your point, Varsha, about things that were cut out of Mahabharata.
Oh yeah, most Mahabharatas don't include that.
So the most Mahabharatas I read as a kid ended right after the war, and like everyone is dead, and they skip one of the like most worst parts is when the Pandavas, the five heroes of their story, this warrior on the Kaurava side sneaks into the Pandavas' camp at night and murders their sons in their sleep, thinking that they're Pandavas.
Yeah, it's like the last
and so
night
that's always cut out. So all my childhood Mahabharata was like, they won the war.
Yeah, and also like the 36
The end.
and the 36 years that they rule the kingdom afterward, where
They don't tell you that.
so little kingdom left, and Yudhishthira is miserable the whole time. Right, he constantly wants to go to the forest. Like, enough of this kingship.
Not in any of the Mahabharatas I grew up with, though.
So I have a question that I don't know.
I'm really sorry.
I don't know if we can answer. I don't know if you guys have the answer, but like, obviously in ancient times when they're reading this, the Sanskrit version, right? Who is reading this? Is it kings are reading this to learn how to be kings? Or is it, you know, priests are reading this to teach their kids how to be better Brahmins? Like, who is reading the text?
It's really unclear. We honestly have very little idea.
Yeah.
Most likely probably the prior, it's most
so
likely
it's interesting with the Sanskrit Mahabharata. There are four frame narratives, which you mentioned, right, Varsha? But very significantly, 3 of them are sages telling a story to a king. Yeah. Right.
Yes.
So I think the idea that this is a story for kings is it's a
I think that would like
good
bear
guess.
that would bear out evidence from within the text. Do we have any evidence from without the text? No.
Right. And you know, Matt, you were asking about oral traditions.
Yeah.
Mahabharata wasn't written down for a long time, right? It was heard.
Sure.
Yeah, but it was also developed like in writing.
Right, but also
from an early period.
From an early period, but it was also transmitted orally as well.
Yeah, but it was like the two things were happening at the same time.
So who knows? So I think
And my favorite thing is in the beginning of the text when the I don't know the name of this priest guy. He's talking to Janamejaya and he's like, Janamejaya says, Vaishnampayana, he says Janamejaya says the snake sacrifice is supposed to take like 18 years or something. And Vaishnampayana is like, yeah, I have a story that long. Let's go. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's 15 times the length of the Bible, the Sanskrit Mahabharata, right? Yeah. You know, it's 100,000 verses, but that's really 200,000 lines if a shloka is 2 lines. So it's massive. If you see the critical edition and, you know, like my advisor Bob Goldman in his office, it takes up an entire shelf, the whole Mahabharata, and it's just.
I read somewhere that apparently it's bad luck to try to translate it or read the whole thing. Yes. Why is that?
Yeah.
It's a story about a family that is torn apart and fighting with each other, right? So that's not a story you want to be reading at home.
That is bad energy.
Especially, you know, in times when people were living in joint families and cousins were living home together. It's not an auspicious text to have at home. The Gita is fine, right? Because word of God, and people kind of see it now almost as like, you know, when I teach like Hindu studies classes, often and I'm like, maybe we wouldn't call it that, but you know, it's kind of it's achieved this status, right? Of course, but it's achieved this status as this really important Hindu text. But the Sanskrit Mahabharata is a very inauspicious text to keep in your home, and even you don't read it from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, there's something. There's about the complete Mahabharata in any form is always a little suspect. There's something about telling the whole story, right? And if you think about it, right, when you tell any story, the whole story, there's really no such thing as like a happy ending. I mean, to tell the whole story is ultimately to tell something that is not going to end well. I mean, all stories, if you really tell the whole story, it never ends well. So I think that this sort of superstition, I'm going to use the word superstition, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's this sort of idea that the Mahabharata, especially in complete form, has this dangerous energy. Is I think it's like sort of well taken. Like it's it comes from someplace meaningful.
So can I ask kind of a question related to this? Is that, you know, you've talked about kind of all of you guys have talked about kind of the complete Mahabharata. So, but if there's many versions and there's many tellings, like what does that mean, right? Like, so like, which is like, is there the right one? Or, I mean, I'm sure there's various traditions which are saying ours is the correct one and theirs isn't, right? But so like, how do scholars kind of negotiate that?
Right. I think that's also, I think that's a huge reason why Nell and I wanted to put together this pre-conference that became the book, Many Mahabharatas, because you find there's so many people, right, who think that, oh, you know, the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata is the Mahabharata, Yeah. And the critical edition, right, was made from manuscripts from all over South Asia.
It was
an
incredible philological project.
So much work went into it, right?
Yeah.
And like they were just looking at all these manuscripts.
I mean, they're collating everything.
And if there's a line that's not in the manuscript from, Gujarat,
put it in
from
the
Bengal, then they put it in like an appendix, and it was crazy. But like, there's never just been even saying just one Sanskrit Mahabharata. That's an impossible thing to say.
There is no one
so
Sanskrit
many
Mahabharata.
different Sanskrit recensions of the Mahabharata, and then just like one thing that blew my mind when I was a kid was there was a scene that I was alluding to earlier, which some people see as the catalyst of the Mahabharata war, in which Draupadi, who is the shared wife of the, I meant to say wife, but wives shared. Anyway, she's a shared wife, singular, of the 5 Pandava heroes. And there's a scene in which the eldest Pandava, Yudhishthira, has lost everything, right? His kingdom, his brothers.
He's not just lost it, he gambled it away.
He gambles it away.
He
gambles it away. Like
Right.
an idiot. Like he willingly goes to his cousin's house, plays a dice game with them. He continues to play this dice game when like people in his head are like, yo, you shouldn't be playing this dice game. It's clearly rigged. Like something's going on, something's fishy, right? Like they say in Hindi, dal mein kuch kala hai, like there's something black in the dal. But still, he gambles it all away, and then in the end, he loses Draupadi, right?
Yeah,
and then even when she gets her 3 boons and she gets them all back, she wins. I mean, she asked Dhritarashtra for her husband's freedoms. She gets them all back. They're allowed to leave. They have everything back.
And he gambles again. Everything.
And then Duryodhana invites him back for one more round.
One more round.
I mean, I don't know
and
if
he
there
does
was
it again.
like Gamblers Anonymous back in the time, but Yudhishthira really needed it. But he
and then later Draupadi, I mean, when they're like in their forced exile because they've lost everything, when they're in their forced exile, Draupadi was like, this gambler, like what unlucky woman would have this gambler for a husband? Like you need to get our kingdom back. What are you doing? How are you not angry? Like, look at us. I don't even get to sleep in my bed anymore. Like, what?
But you were saying that like they say this a lot in Hindi TV serials and in movies when they want to talk about how like the fierceness of a woman. They're like the Mahabharata is really fought over a woman's honor, right? So it's about Draupadi, right?
So what I was going back to when Matt was asking, we get very excited about the Mahabharata. When Matt was asking about the original, what is right, what is correct, right? So there's this first gambling match, right? And Yudhishthira loses Draupadi, and the Kauravas attempt to strip her naked in front of everyone in the assembly hall. She also has her period at this time, so she shouldn't even be
like
with
highly,
other men.
it's like literal every symbol of sexual vulnerability is present in that scene.
And it's this terrifying, horrible scene. But magically, somehow
one of the Sanskrit version is really one of the greatest scenes I think in all of world literature. Like I think if you read any scene of the Mahabharata from start to finish,
read the disrobing of Draupadi.
Well, the dice game. The dice game.
Yeah.
Like it's.
But anyway, so so magically, her sari or her garment, as it's being pulled by Dushasana, one of the Kauravas, it just keeps on like replacing itself and replicating itself. And as a kid, and in most Mahabharatas you will read or see, it is Krishna who gives the Bhagavad-Gita, this very important Hindu deity, who replaces Draupadi's sari.
Yeah.
But that is not in the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. It is in many different recensions of the Sanskrit Mahabharata from different places, but it's not in the critical edition. And I remember learning that just like blowing my mind because
it's also not in a lot of manuscripts.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you do see versions of it in like those other manuscripts that they were looking at when they made the critical edition, like it's
they're different,
right? Yeah, Krishna's role is different in every single one, and so anyway, so there are a lot that also didn't have it, which is really amazing.
But I've also told this to undergrad students when I'm teaching the Mahabharata, and they have gotten very angry at me. Krishna saved Draupadi. She didn't save herself. It was Krishna. Krishna did it because, and I'm sure Nell can speak more about this, but in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, what is it? Is it Draupadi herself?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Feminism or whatever the mess.
I mean, in the right, exactly. In the versions where Krishna does not appear, the idea is that the sort of, I think the implication is that the force of Draupadi's virtue makes it possible her for every time a garment is pulled off or to have a new one replace it. Without any kind of divine intervention. And to be fair, this is a woman who at no other point in the Sanskrit Mahabharata ever asks for divine intervention.
Well,
now about where Krishna was really there.
No. I mean, I totally accept the versions where he is.
Actually, was about to say
and like them.
what I was about to say before my dog interrupted was just yesterday I saw a really interesting television version of the Mahabharata that was made in 2016, in which Draupadi prays to Krishna, but then all of the Kauravas, the Kauravas' mother Gandhari, the blindfolded woman, the grandmother Satyavati, and the Bhanumati, Duryodhana's wives, and all of the Kuru wives tear off their own saris and throw it over a balcony. Ooh. And they just keep on throwing their saris. I mean, she prays to Krishna, but it's all the wives who are, you know, saving him. And if you look at the YouTube comments, like, people are getting mad. They're like, what? Krishna saved Draupadi.
Krishna! But that's my favorite thing about anytime I want to piss off someone who's like a little bit older and Indian and like very Hindu, I start telling them that like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata is like deeply sexist. And I start pointing out stories like this, and they're like, no, it's not. Like, Krishna did this. Or like Rama was just doubting Sita like any husband would. And I'm like, what? So it's that was actually my next question. Have you guys ended up watching India, like Indians love stories like this, obviously. And in the 1980s, the Mahabharata was a TV show, like massively famous. It was translated into like a bunch of other languages. People across the world watched it. It's like 100 episodes. Did you guys watch that? And did you watch the much hotter 2013 version, which is on Hotstar?
Different versions lately that I've been learning about. So this one is from the one I was just talking about is a 2016 version called Draupadi. All the episodes are available on YouTube. During the pandemic, India's national TV channel Doordarshan, which originally aired the Mahabharata in, between 1988 and 1990, they rebroadcast it, and it was a huge, billion
huge hit.
Watching it stuck at home. But there have just been so many. There's another TV show called Dharmashetra, in which all of the characters of the Mahabharata after the war,
they're like on trial.
They're on trial by the other characters.
Yeah.
So like, for example,
so it's like set in like a court of law, and then Karna is the first person to like come on trial, the first character.
It's
Draupadi. But the first question that she's asked is about Karna. Yeah. It's like, did you love him more than?
Yeah, it's just there's so much drama. It used to be on Netflix, it's now on Amazon Prime. There are just so many. There's just so
many. Wow.
There's this there's a children's novel series which Nell introduced me to.
No, but like my friend who reads like fantasy novels introduced me to it.
And it's a Varsha, you would love this. It's about these Indian American, they're not all Indian American. Oh, really? I think one is Fijian American or something. Very cool. Filipino American, but these girls who find out that they are reincarnations of the Pandavas, and they are all like born into different families, and like one is in Georgia, and then it's kind of like Percy Jackson, but it's Arusha so it's like these 5 girls,
Pandava sisters,
and then
that's so cute.
Reincarnated as a boy. It's so cool.
Like,
I mean,
it's so adorable.
It's like it blows my mind how many and interesting different
and what's so incredible about it is that I think we've been sort of talking about like more modern Mahabharatas on the like popular end of the spectrum, but there are so many Mahabharatas now that are being made in much more, I want to say like high art or sort of like forms, right? So it's not just the sort of like popular genres, but for example, Karthika Nayar's book of poetry, Until the Lions, which is incredible. It sort of retells the Mahabharata in different poetic forms in English, largely through the eyes and voices of the Mahabharata's women characters,
the dog,
which is amazing. The dog shows up.
The dog as a poem.
So so there's that. I mean, there are these like this play that we're consulting on, which is really exciting.
We've been kind of consulting on 2 different Mahabharata.
Yeah, we've been consulting on like modern
dance
Mahabharata
dramas that are going to be produced within the next year or 2.
Yeah, which is great.
There's
one in Singapore.
Cool.
They just never end. There's always new Mahabharatas that keep on being produced in so many different. And there's one person who tweeted the Mahabharata.
Yeah, and then it became a book. Yeah, it's called Epic Retold. Yeah.
I mean, that's me reading it. I'm like retelling it with like sassy tweets because I'm just like, I just get so.
I want to watch you live tweet the Mahabharata.
Yes. So we should get to audience questions, but there is a really good question. Just to begin with, Mike asked if there's an edition you would recommend for newbies. So is this the best edition for newbies, or is there a better one?
I would say for complete novices, I would actually recommend Carol Satyamurthy's English retelling of the Mahabharata.
It's like a free verse. It's very beautiful.
Yes. It's quite hefty. I have it over there.
She used the like Sanskrit critical edition as the source material.
The edition that Varsha has by John Smith, which is amazing, but there's a lot of like diacritics there, and a lot of it is summary. It can be a little confusing for someone who's completely new to the Mahabharata.
Yeah, I think the second version is really nice.
So for some,
also, frankly, Amrita Patel's graphic novel called Adi Parva is an incredible introduction to the Mahabharata as a graphic novel. It's only the very sort of beginning part of the Mahabharata and the setup, but I think it's a really lovely way of getting into that whole world aesthetically and poetically, and the characters are there. So that's Amrita Patel's Adi Parva.
Unfortunately, a lot of the Hindi shows television shows we talk about don't have subtitles, but I do think there is a Netflix Bollywood Mahabharata movie with like Vidya Balan as Draupadi, and has a pretty and it has subtitles, and I think it's under 3 hours. So that's another way. That's very short for Mahabharata. So I think those are some good places to start.
I like your idea about
That's kind of, if I could kind of follow up, so related to kind of where to start, Sumanth had a question from the audience about kind of, you've talked about kind of various versions, like what do we know about kind of what are the origins of the Mahabharata? Like what kind of time period does it come out of? What kind of political, cultural context, stuff like that? Like how far can we trace it back, and how do we kind of know what we know about it?
That's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, the short answer is we really know very little, but what we do know is that the Sanskrit Mahabharata I almost want to say like Sanskrit Mahabharata sort of collection, given that it wasn't just like one person telling one story and like one other person writing it down, but the sort of collection of Sanskrit Mahabharatas that we initially have appear are sort of composed and compiled between the years 300 BCE to 300 CE ish. So like over that period of like 600 some years, what we now know as the Sanskrit Mahabharata is being composed and or compiled. And as Sohini and I were saying, that's happening both orally and it's happening in writing, probably simultaneously. And this is a sort of, I think, like largely interregnum period between the Maurya and Gupta empires. Like, so, but again, like huge period of time, and also, being composed and compiled really as a sort of, cosmopolitan text, right? So it's really trans-regional, and that's really important.
And there are some theories about certain parts of the Mahabharata. So, for example, the Bhagavad-Gita, in which Krishna is telling Arjuna, fight, 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 right? Some people think this might be a response to Buddhism, a religion about nonviolence, and having this message about nonviolence. And suddenly we get this interlude where Arjuna's like, oh, it's my teachers, it's my cousins, it's my family. And Krishna's like, basically, don't be a eunuch, right?
Yeah, that's what he said.
Man up and kill everybody.
Don't be a eunuch,
right?
And kill everybody. Yeah. So it's really, so if you're sort of looking at the Sanskrit Mahabharata for social, religious issues of what might have been the time, or at least whoever was composing or compiling it sort of reflecting on those issues, it's very fruitful, right? You'll find a lot of sort of conflicts about caste and class. You'll find a lot of questions about what is the role of the Veda and Vedic ritual in this particular world. You'll find a lot of questions about
gender.
Certainly a lot of questions about gender. So and I think the important thing to point out is that all of these categories, in our opinion, are being interrogated, not sort of reified.
Right.
These categories that are just essential to like this corner of South Asian civilization are being interrogated top to bottom. And there is no one single opinion on anything in the Mahabharata.
Or answer to anything.
Yeah, everything is voiced through every sort of comment on how should you rule, what is power like, what should the place of a woman be, what is the point of having castes and classes, and what are the different roles that we expect of people in different parts of society. There is never any clear answer because different characters will voice different answers at different times under different circumstances. But it's very fruitful to sort of see like, wow, these are like clearly some serious issues that people were thinking about and really debating like hotly at the time.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I mean, we've talked about quite a bit on here, but I think it gets lost, especially with our students, is we tend to reify our subjects, right? Is that they were just these objects who they couldn't have acted otherwise. They had to act like kind of necessarily, but these things, they were human beings, right? Like they had complicated emotions and ideas and thoughts and stuff like that. They debated with one another, and, you know, showing them the various versions of text oftentimes is really, really fruitful and really important. So.
Yeah, Matt, I think that's an amazing point, because I think even in the Mahabharata, certainly in the Sanskrit versions and many others, you often have one character saying to another, like, why did you make this decision? Why did you act in this way? Why didn't you do this? Right? And so this sort of whole hypothetical imaginative world is just shining really brightly there at all times, and definitely calling into question any of the decisions that are made along the way.
Because like one of the stories that they don't tell you as a kid that I read recently is when they get sent, the 5 Pandavas get sent on vacation to like this house, right? The Kauravas are like, hey, we're sending you on vacation, but really Duryodhana is just planning to murder them, to burn them alive. So obviously, you know, obviously this sage who's like, you know, the advisor of the Kauravas, he figures out, he's like uncle, he's like the uncle, he figures out, hey, Duryodhana wants to kill you. He sends a message via like pigeon or something to Arjun or to Yudhishthira.
The Airbnb that you booked.
Exactly. Be careful of the Airbnb. And Yudhishthira is like, what's wrong with the Airbnb? And Arjuna is like, idiot, they want to burn us alive. And so Yudhishthira's like, what are we gonna do? And Arjuna's like, I know what you gotta do. We gotta dig a hole under the building. We're going to invite a bunch of people to the house as a huge party. And then when the people, but a week before they're going to plan to burn us alive, right? So a week before they're planning to burn us alive, our cousins, we're going to have a huge party, invite a bunch of people. We'll invite 6 random people who look like us. And then we'll burn these 6 random people alive.
It's so much worse than you think.
They're low caste, tribal.
Low caste people who aren't supposed to be at the party. Yeah.
They won't be missed. It's like, what kind of
They won't be missed. And so they kill these 6 random people who like look like them. And like Arjuna is like, we got to do what we got to do. And Yudhishthira's like, I feel bad. He's like, Arjuna's, we got to do what we got to do. And I tell my mom, I call my mom up after I read this part in the book. And my mom's like, and I tell my mom, hey, they killed 6 random low caste people. My mom's like, they had to do what they had to do. And I'm like, what do you mean? So the reason you should read this text is because it really, it's not like, it's just like when you read the Odyssey in high school, when you realize these people are like really effed up. Right? It's like that. And so that's why this text is just such a good read, because you realize this is actually like real people writing about real things that you do not understand, which is caste and killing people and duty, and what does that actually mean? Because when you read I haven't read the Bhagavad-Gita like incomplete. I've only read an abridged version, but you read the abridged version, and the abridged version, like Arjuna just keeps whining and whining and whining. And Krishna is like, stop whining, man. You just got to do your duty. But he has such a Krishna has such a long like list of things of like what entails duty. And so like now it sort of makes sense why people for like hundreds of years, like they spend one day, every day they read one Sanskrit verse of Bhagavad-Gita and they think about it. It's like reading one Bible verse every day. But based on that, I think one of the questions that I have is, is there like a story that we haven't told that is like your favorite? Like, because this is like a bunch of stories within a bunch of stories, right? Like there's the snake sacrifice, there's the dog who like complains to his mom that he got kicked. There's like so many stories. Is there a story that you really enjoy?
Oh God, I mean, we enjoy all of them, but I mean, there's so many.
Even the ones with mass murder, we enjoy. Just kidding.
The burning of the Kandava forest with the.
This is not. I just want to say I'm still saving my like favorite story for like later. This is not it, but the stories that do describe the sort of mass carnage on the battlefield are really vivid and incredible. Like the metaphors of, you know, there are little like rivers of blood where the heads of the slain warriors that have been like decapitated are like floating on the rivers, on this river of blood. And I don't know, there's a lot of blood imagery. It's like, you know, people are still the blood spurting out everywhere so that they look like the sort of red blossoming kimchika tree. Like, I mean, it's very, very like just pages and pages and pages, verses and verses and verses, chapters and chapters of this incredibly vivid sort of violent imagery, and it's beautiful in some sense, and in some sense it's also so over the top that I don't know, it's just, how can you think that this is really a text that's like glorifying violence? I mean, it's doing something very interesting with violence. It's neither glorifying it nor is it necessarily an anti-war text, though I think in some ways you could read it that way. I don't know. Do you have like a favorite story that we haven't mentioned? I mean, there's so many that we love.
I think like one of my favorite characters is Amba / Shikandini / Shikandin, which is a very super complicated story, but basically, I don't even know how I would.
She's the first wife, right?
Yeah. Well, it all starts with a woman who was kidnapped.
Marriage, yes.
And this is like a kidnapped marriage that like really went wrong.
Yeah. It went real wrong.
Just like basically a story about a woman who goes so far to get her revenge against, you know, this grandfather figure of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, that she sets herself on fire and is reborn as Draupadi's sister, and then changes her trades.
Who was raised as a man.
And then raised as a princess. Trades her gender with someone and becomes a man, right?
Yeah.
There's also so many different retellings of her story that it's hard to keep track. But it's just it's just an amazing story about Amba.
And she ultimately ends up playing a really big role in the eventual death and killing of the person who captured her.
Yeah, but she had to be reborn and change her gender in order to do this, but she follows through and does. But then tragically is killed in that horrible story I was saying, where the Pandava sons are killed overnight. She is killed as well
not even the text is clear. So that's an amazing story. I mean, full of like classic Mahabharata, like full of twists and turns.
So my favorite story that I did not know as a kid, and I only learned about it recently when I was rereading, is the idea that in this whole text, the idea of parentage is really important, because sometimes you have a kid, right? You're this prince or a king or something. You go into this town, you meet this beautiful lady who's actually like a goddess or something. You have a kid with her. She shows up 20 years later. She's like, here's your kid. And the king is like, no, man, that's not my kid. And then the gods are like, yeah, that's your kid. That's your kid. My favorite story of this is Kunti. She's the mother of the Pandavas, right? So Kunti, before she marries Pandu, she's granted a boon, where the boon says she can bear a child with any of the gods. She just has to say this prayer and a god will show up and give her a kid with him. And so before she gets married, she's like, okay, I have this boon, but I'm not married yet. Let me just test this out. What if this boon doesn't work? So without being married, without like knowing anything, she decides this boon probably doesn't work. This prayer doesn't work. She says the prayer, the god shows up and she's like, no, I don't want the kid. And he's like,
yeah, and
it's you want the kid.
It's a very Moses in the basket kind of story, right? So she calls Surya.
So she has this kid. She calls Surya, who's the god of the sun. She has this kid who like is born with armor all around him. Like he's like born with armor.
Bargains for that armor. right?
Yeah.
Because
She
originally
has to send him away.
Yeah, well, originally it's going to be sort of the normal way because she calls upon Surya and he's like, okay, I'm totally ready to do this. And she's like, oh, JK, that's fine. Can you please leave now? And he's like,
Wrong
no,
number.
no.
I didn't
He's
mean
like,
to call.
no, you said we were going to do this. And she's like, okay, but under two conditions. A, I get my virginity back, which is like a big thing.
Women just get their virginity back whenever they want.
Draupadi, so that she has 5 husbands, right? Five
everyone.
husbands. Every year after she's with one husband, her virginity is restored.
But like Satyavati also got that.
Yeah.
After she did it with Parashara on the boat. And that's how Vyasa got born. And then she asked for her virginity back and also to smell better because she had this very fishy smell.
She smelled like fish.
When she meets Shantanu, she smells amazing. And he's like, ooh, yeah. So, God, I've had too much of this.
There's so many good stories.
Anyway, the Kunti is like, I want my virginity back and I want this kid to be born with inborn armor and earrings that will protect him forever.
But then
But then the thing is, no one is going to take care of this kid because she's not married. It's huge disgrace, right? So she literally sends him down the river. He's raised by this charioteer, a lower caste charioteer. Years later, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, they're having this battle, think like WWE. They're having this like battle basically, right? And
it really is because it's kind of fake. It's like it's not,
so fake. No one's actually gonna die. So Karna shows up to fight, and Bhima, who's like sort of an asshole, he's the third Pandava brother. He's like, Karna, you can't fight. You're lower caste. Your dad is a charioteer. And so Duryodhana, the head of the Kauravas, he shows up like, I give him a kingdom. He fights. And like Kunti is in the background. She's looking at the Pandava. She's all happy. But then she sees Karna and she sees his armor. She's like, oh my God, that's my son. And she's just sobbing. She doesn't tell him she's his mother until much later. Later when the war is actually happening, Karna realizes he's fighting his half brothers. He's like, oh God, what have I done? So he's my favorite character because he's like, really, really messed up. So I just wanted to say that.
And so beloved in South India.
Yeah.
Everyone loves
so beloved.
The tragic hero.
Karna's a lot of people's favorite character, and for good reason. There's something deeply there's something really special about one of the many special things about Karna, in addition to just the sort of sheer amount of like, I want to say almost like narrative, like sympathy that he gets in the text, despite being on the quote unquote wrong side. He, as I'm sure you have read in your like in the last month, Varsha, that at a certain point, Karna elects to give up his armor and earrings. Yeah, I mean, this is
he has to cut them off.
Yeah, and he gives them, and it's because Indra, always playing, comes to him and is like, you've sworn this vow that you'll give anything to a Brahmin if asked. And Indra comes as a Brahmin and is like, I want to make my son Arjuna and all of his brothers, win in this war. And what do we have to do? We have to basically sort of disarm Karna because otherwise Karna fighting for the other side will be too powerful. And when Indra comes to him in the guise of a Brahmin and says, give me your armor and earrings, and Karna then chooses to do it. And frankly, like in the Mahabharata, you can bargain your way out of anything. It happens all the time, right? This was not a given.
No vow is unbreakable.
Right? In my reading, this is a choice. And I think that's part of why he has so much sort of like sympathy and like fandom almost in the whole Mahabharata tradition, is that this is a person a character, a figure who could have been immortal and chose to be mortal.
Another really awesome thing, just because like there are a couple of questions that are important on this, but like one thing that I think is really important is like Bhishma's character. So Bhishma, if Matt and Rachel don't know, and the audience don't know,
right?
Yeah, he's the uncle, right? He's the uncle. He basically, brings up Pandu and Dhritarashtra, and he makes a vow to his father because his father has the Bhishma with his first wife, and then he falls in love with a second wife, right? And so he makes a vow to his father. He says, you want to marry this second lady who's a stepmother, go ahead. But his father says, I can't marry her. She wants, her sons to be king, not you. And Bhishma was like, go for it. I will promise never to be king. And so when the war starts, he refuses to fight in the war. He refuses to do anything in the war. And he has this boon where he can choose when and how to die. And so he chooses to die on a bed of arrows. And while he's dying, he's like literally saying, Yudhishthira's asking him his questions, like bothering him on his deathbed on a bed of arrows. And Bhishma is just like calmly saying, just say the 1,000 name of Vishnu, like you'll be fine. You'll reach like heaven, like, you'll reach all the knowledge you need to reach. And so Bhishma is another, like, as a fangirl to Mahabharata now, like Bhishma and Karna, 2 favorite characters.
Just a slight amendment. So Bhishma does fight during the war, and he's killing everybody, and it's a big problem because it's 18-day war in 10 days, and Bhishma's still out there, and he's this old grandpa who's killing everybody, and it's because of Amba, the character I talked about.
Right, she comes back.
Yeah, and that's how they get Bhishma. So
Arjuna puts him in front of him, and then Drishtadyumna.
Matt, I just want to apologize for all the character names for throwing out. And so, often in my classes I teach on the Mahabharata, I just compare it to Game of Thrones in that there's so many characters to keep track of, right? And like, we're both huge Game of Thrones fans.
Yeah.
But
it's footnote number 9 in our book.
Like keeping track of like Tyrion and Tywin and all these characters with similar names and
all the like different storylines.
And there's all these different families. This is the Mahabharata. It's just there's so many different characters and families, and they're all fighting.
So
it's
that was kind of a question that I had. We talked about like Sohini, like you're starting a new position in the fall, right? And you both are experienced kind of instructors. Like how do you teach this? How do you, especially for a lot of undergraduates who probably have never heard of this before, right? And then especially in a religion department too, which is a peculiar, rather than even like a history course, is that you're going to have religiously committed students alongside those students who don't know anything, who know the right way to interpret that. So how do you kind of navigate this in your teaching?
So I think it'd be a bit different for Nell and I, since Nell is often teaching the Mahabharata in Sanskrit. She has students reading it. Actually, so what I like to do with my students is introduce the Mahabharata to them the way I was introduced to it. And I often just start with a 30-page comic book. It just makes it a lot easier to digest and to kind of keep track of character names. What I actually did in 2019 was I showed, and this is already a truncated version of a Mahabharata. It's a play by Peter Brooks, this Mahabharata play, and it's quite problematic in many ways. For example, all of the kind of demonic and very strong characters are played by African actors or African American actors. Drona, this kind of very like wise, almost invincible teacher, is played by a Japanese actor, like kind of like a samurai. It's a very interesting international cast in that there's only one South Asian actor who plays Draupadi. And so I showed my students this kind of 3-hour-long play that's been recorded on video. And it brought up a lot of really good questions about cultural appropriation. And even though it's so problematic, they were able to keep track of all of the characters and stories that way. So I just, when I'm introducing the Mahabharata and the story and the plot, I just try and find, a kind of condensed version. And it's interesting that with the students who come from, Hindu backgrounds, often this Amar Chitra Katha comic book was their first introduction, which is great.
Yeah.
I think that this is like a wonderful idea. I mean, I also, with my students who are just coming to the Mahabharata, and when I teach it like in English translation, I try to use the Sanskrit Mahabharata's first 2 frame stories as 2 ways into the text. And I think this is especially useful for all of us to sort of understand, especially students who are coming to this from a South Asian background where they may have heard stories, as so many did, right? Like stories from the Mahabharata growing up. And I think the 2 initial frame stories of the Mahabharata give us 2 really important and complementary ways into the text. In the outermost frame story, you have a sage walking into a forest, a bard really, a bard walking into a forest where a group of sages are performing a sacrifice, and they want to hear a story. I mean, that's what you do at the intervals in a long ritual. You listen to stories. They want to hear a story, and they've heard of this Mahabharata thing that has happened, and that's the story that they want to hear. And then with it, so that is the absolute outermost frame story of the Mahabharata. Then one frame in, you have another sage, this is Vaishampayana, whom Varsha was mentioning, telling the whole story of the Mahabharata to Janamejaya at the intervals in his snake sacrifice. And the thing about Janamejaya, this new listener, is that he is the direct descendant of the Pandavas. And so in itself, the Sanskrit Mahabharata gives us two ways into the story. One is, this is an amazing story. Listen. The other is, this is the story of
your family.
This is your story. Yeah. And I think like this is your story can also apply to people who are not of South Asian descent. I think there's something for everyone in the Mahabharata, and something really deeply personal and touching about it, no matter where you've come from. But I think it means something to introduce it in those two ways, especially for students who already feel a personal connection with the text. And the Mahabharata itself gives us those two ways in.
Great. So unfortunately, I think we're just about out of time. So this has been a really fascinating conversation. I mean, one of the great things is that we all have like 4 books to go by right now. So, you know, not just Nell and Sohini's book, of course, but, you know, some sort of edition of the Mahabharata itself.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone, the whole point of us doing what we do and doing the book was to get other people to read whatever version of the Mahabharata or watch whatever version of the Mahabharata is accessible to them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
You definitely should. Really,
Yes,
because it's just really trippy. It's just so good. I mean, I don't know if you're not Indian and you're reading it for the first time, like it might not have that big of an effect on you. But if you grew up with a version of the story as a kid, reading another version as an adult, you like have like a totally new perspective on your culture and like your family history, just like Janamejaya, who's listening to his family history. I'm just saying. So yeah. Because like the stories, just last story is like, so my favorite story my mom loved to tell me as a kid from the Mahabharata is Krishna comes to the Pandavas' house when they're in exile to eat, right? And Kunti is like freaked out because she doesn't have that much food. She's like, I only have a few grains of rice. And Krishna is like, that's fine. And he picks the grains of rice off the floor and he eats them. He's like, I'm full. And he leaves. And my mom tells me that story whenever I wanted to waste food as a kid. She's like, no, you can't waste food as a kid, because Krishna wouldn't even waste a grain of rice.
And with that, drink every drop of your drink.
Yes.
That's
Exactly.
right. That's right.
I only made it to the second one, but
Oh, okay. Well, mission almost accomplished, I guess.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to Sohini and Nell for talking with us about the many Mahabharatas. And on behalf of everybody, let me simply say, enjoy your Friday wherever you are, and cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.